I never imagined the first day of the rest of my life would begin inside a funeral hall. Death has a way of rearranging the furniture of the soul, and when Robert's casket lay at the front of the chapel, polished and perfect like every part of the image he had always cared so deeply about, I thought the day would be about him. But I was wrong. That day was about me, about the hidden life I had never been invited to, and about the moment the ground gave way beneath my feet. I wore Robert's favorite charcoal gray wool coat, the one he always said made me look dignified. The fabric scratched faintly against my wrists as I stood at the chapel entrance, greeting guests with a smile I had practiced in the mirror. The wind outside had been sharp, slicing through me, and my fingers were stiff from the cold, but I held myself steady. 40 years of marriage had trained me well in appearances. Nothing out of place, nothing raw, exposed. He would have wanted it that way. Robert had always cared more for appearances than for tenderness. Even in death, I felt obligated to protect the image he had spent decades curating. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies, their perfume heavy, mingling with the musk of old wood and the faint wax of burning candles. I kept nodding as guests murmured the same practiced lines. He was such a good man. We'll miss him. Each phrase passed through me like air through a cracked window. I accepted their words because that's what was expected. Dignity, order, composure, that was my role. Then Daniel walked to the podium. My son, my only child, 33 years old, his dark suit cut neatly against his frame, his face solemn but steady. His voice, when he began, carried the same deliberate weight it always had, the measured tone of an engineer who was used to making sure things lined up just right. He spoke about his father's dedication, his discipline, the way he worked tirelessly for his family. I sat with my handbag on my lap, my knuckles pressed white against the handles, and listened. This was my moment, I thought. The moment he would say it. Acknowledge me, his mother, the woman who had spent her life stitching together the fragments of our family with invisible thread. And then Daniel's voice shifted. It grew softer, trembled faintly. The audience leaned forward in silence. He paused, his eyes glistening. My heart beat faster. Surely now he would say it. My mother. Surely he would finally see me. There's someone I want to give a special thank you to, Daniel said, and I could feel the air grow taut around us. Someone who supported my father through the hardest times of his life. Someone who was truly family. The words carved into me like a dull blade. And then he said her name. Ms. Linda Mallister. A soft murmur rippled through the pews. Heads turned, eyes shifting toward the front row. There she was, Linda, in a fitted emerald coat, her makeup flawless, her hair styled into soft waves that looked effortless but deliberate. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a delicate tissue, standing briefly before nodding modestly. She had tears in her eyes, just enough to glimmer, not enough to smudge the perfect mask she wore. Then she sat back down, perfectly composed, while people around her whispered with curiosity. And I? I sat on the side, unnoticed, the real wife, the mother, invisible. The sound in my ears was like an explosion of silence, deafening. My chair felt as though it had disappeared beneath me. Daniel's words still hung in the air. Linda, the true family. Not me, never me. I had known her name, of course. Linda Mallister had once been Robert's administrative assistant, then a consultant, eventually even a partner at his firm. I remembered asking Robert about her once, years ago. He brushed it off. She's competent. Don't be paranoid. At company parties, she was there, smiling, gliding through conversations with the confidence of a woman who knew she belonged. I used to dismiss her as just another sycophantic employee, flattering her way upward. How naive I had been. From across the chapel, someone whispered, "She's sitting so close, like she's family." And indeed, she was sitting there close enough to touch the casket, closer than I was to the man I had lived beside for 4 decades. My own son had just thanked her as if she had been the one who mattered most. The service blurred after that. People shook my hand, murmured more condolences. My responses came automatically, like a machine programmed to nod, smile, repeat. All the while, Daniel leaned toward Linda, whispering something I caught in fragments. "You're the one who's truly family," he said to her. My throat tightened, and I nearly dropped the porcelain teacup someone had pressed into my hand. That funeral wasn't Robert's, not really. It was Linda's unveiling, a private truth brought out into the open while I sat in the shadows, discarded, erased. Later that night, when the guests were gone and the flowers had begun to droop, I returned home to the quiet of the living room. I slipped off the gray coat and noticed its satin ribbon was crumpled, twisted as if even the garment itself had surrendered. I sat at the dining table staring at the row of empty chairs. Robert's seat was still at the head, untouched. For decades, that was where he sat, one hand on the armrest, waiting for me to place soup in front of him. Now it was empty, cold. The room felt like a mausoleum of habit. In the refrigerator, bottles of his bitter beer waited, untouched. I had never liked the brand, but he insisted on buying them every week. Rituals, I thought, are prisons disguised as order. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I pulled out old photo albums. There we were, young, smiling, Robert's eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in years. I found an old employee ID of mine from when I worked as a financial consultant in his firm. My hair was cropped short then, my expression confident. That was before Robert convinced me to give it all up. "I'll take care of you," he said. "You don't need to work." Foolishly, I believed it was love. Foolishly, I gave up my place in the world. I closed the album and poured a glass of water. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the stillness. It struck me then that all the patience, all the sacrifices I had poured into that marriage had been buried with him. And yet, beneath that burial lay something deeper, something I hadn't even uncovered yet. But that discovery would come later. That night, sitting in silence, I began to feel the first edges of something new, like a blade against old fabric. I had thought my life ended with Robert's accident. I hadn't known yet that it was just beginning. The morning after the funeral, I found myself in an office that smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and the weight of too many lives reduced to documents. The law firm Robert had designated was tucked inside a downtown building whose blinds sliced sunlight into narrow stripes across the floor. A crooked print of the Constitution hung on the wall, reminding me that justice was rarely straight. I sat across from a man in his 50s whose voice was heavy, deliberate. He began to read Robert's will with the mechanical calm of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Pursuant to the will signed 3 years ago by Mr. Robert Desmond Smith. His words were slow, too slow, as though each syllable was meant to underscore something unspoken. My hands tightened around my handbag. My breath stayed shallow. He listed Robert's assets, the main residence in Summerall, the summer property in Nantucket, the bank accounts, investments, residual company shares. And then he said it, flatly, without emotion, all to be inherited by Ms. Linda Mallister. The air left my lungs as though I had been struck. My name wasn't in the document, not a single dollar, not a single acknowledgement of 40 years of marriage. The lawyer's voice continued, but I barely heard him. I turned my head to Daniel, hoping, praying, for outrage, for shock, for something in his expression that mirrored my disbelief. But his face was perfectly composed, his spine straight, his fingers folded. He looked as though he were sitting through a quarterly financial report. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. His calm was worse than betrayal. It was familiarity. When the lawyer finished, I stood, my knees trembling. I walked over to Daniel. "You knew," I whispered. My voice shook, but the words were sharp enough to cut. His eyes met mine with a strange serenity, almost detached. Dad had his reasons. His reasons? My voice cracked. What did 40 years of marriage mean to him then? The words burned my throat on their way out. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then lowered his gaze. "He worked hard his whole life," he said softly. "Linda was there for him. She understood him." He paused, his voice almost apologetic, yet firm. "You didn't." The room tilted. I wasn't only losing Robert. In that moment, I was losing Daniel too. My son wasn't defending his father's memory. He was redrawing the family tree, and I was being erased from its roots. When I returned home, I stood in the driveway with my handbag weighing heavily against my arm, unwilling to cross the threshold. The house loomed in front of me. Robert's house now, not mine. Eventually, I walked inside and into the bedroom. His closet was untouched. Shirts lined up neatly, ties perfectly folded, wool vests arranged in the order he preferred. The faint smell of cedar and cologne lingered. My hand brushed over the fabrics, and I thought, what lies were sewn into these threads? When had he decided I no longer belonged? Was it years ago when I forgot to buy his favorite wine for our anniversary? Or earlier, when I quit my job at his urging, letting my identity shrink to the boundaries of this home? I searched for answers, digging through drawers. Old ledgers, faded photographs, receipts, business cards. In the kitchen drawer, I found a folder filled with letters. One caught my eye, an envelope from the Nantucket Property Management Company, dated 6 years ago, addressed to Linda. My stomach twisted. I had been to that seaside house countless times, believing it was ours. I hadn't known I was just a guest in my own marriage. That afternoon, I walked across the street to visit Giselle, our neighbor. She was a widow in her late 70s, sharp-minded, her garden overflowing with roses. We sat in her sunroom, the light falling warmly on lace curtains. When I mentioned Linda's name, Giselle's expression hardened. "Linda," she said slowly. "Wasn't she the one Robert used to take to symphonies?" Her eyebrow arched. "You didn't go with them?" My throat was dry, but I forced a smile. I never much liked those events. Giselle stirred her tea. "Oh, I always thought they were an item. She was here plenty of times. One Christmas, she helped Robert put up lights. I remember because you were upstairs with your knee injury. He told me a neighborhood boy helped him. Guess it wasn't." Her words landed like stones. My chest tightened. "Do you remember when they started getting close?" I asked quietly. She tilted her head, thinking. "At least 10, maybe 15 years ago. I remember seeing her around when you were away caring for your sister. 15 years. My life fractured at the sound of it. All that time, while I budgeted every retirement dollar, managed his health appointments, even dipped into my parents' savings to rescue his company during a cash crisis. He was building another future, brick by golden brick for her. Back home, I descended into the basement, my hands shaking as I rummaged through old boxes. One was filled with photographs. My eyes stopped on an image of Robert standing next to Linda at a company event. His hand rested gently on her arm, his smile radiant in a way I had never seen when he was beside me. He looked lighter, younger, free. Another photo, Daniel, barely 19, standing beside them. His expression shy but comfortable, as if he belonged with them. At the corner of the photo, a faint pen mark caught my eye. I rubbed the paper gently and uncovered the words written there. "Our little family will be official one day." It wasn't glass that shattered inside me. It wasn't even my heart. It was something deeper, something I hadn't even known was fragile. Trust. And it would never be whole again. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen. Its flame flickered against the tiles, throwing soft shadows across the room. For the first time since Robert's death, I put on music, a slow, sultry jazz record. I let the notes wash over me as I sat at the table. Perhaps I had lived all these years to his rhythm, never dancing to my own. Perhaps that was about to change. I pressed my palms flat against the wood of the table and whispered to myself, "Not anymore." But I thought the worst was behind me. The funeral, the humiliation, the will. I didn't yet realize that the true heartbreak was still ahead. It would come not from Robert, not even from Linda, but from Daniel, my son. The boy I had once carried through the storms of his childhood. The boy I thought would never abandon me. And when that moment came, it would cut deeper than anything Robert had ever done. A week later, Daniel asked to meet me at the town cafe. It was the same one we had visited countless times when he was little, the place where he used to order caramel desserts and lick the spoon with a grin that always made me laugh. I walked there slowly, rehearsing what I would say, reminding myself that this was still my son, still the boy who once needed me for everything. I told myself there was hope. When I arrived, I saw him immediately. He was seated at a corner table, dressed in a long trench coat that made him look older than his years, stiff, too formal. His posture was sharp, his shoulders square, his face composed in the way people compose themselves for interviews or court appearances. Not for their mothers. Before I could sit down, he placed his phone face down on the table, a small gesture, but one I knew well. For Daniel, it meant the conversation had limits. Any buzz, any ring, and he would stand up and leave as though I were a business appointment. A subtle reminder of who controlled the time. "Why did you send Linda a legal notice?" he asked, blunt and cold. No greeting, no warmth, just a confrontation, as though I were the intruder. I lowered myself into the chair and drew in a steady breath. Do you think I shouldn't have? My voice was calm, though my heart beat unevenly in my chest. He shrugged, looking away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. She didn't hurt you. Dad gave her the money. It was his decision. Suing her just makes everyone uncomfortable. The word stung. Uncomfortable. As though betrayal was simply a social inconvenience, something that could be smoothed over with polite silence. I leaned forward, my voice trembling. Uncomfortable? Daniel, your father deceived me for decades. He built another life with her while I... My throat tightened. I gave up my career for this family. I gave up my friends. I even sold my mother's emerald ring to pay your college tuition. Do you know what that ring meant to me? For a moment, I thought he might soften. His brows furrowed, his lips pressed together. But then he exhaled with irritation, shaking his head. You always bring that up, like I owe you something. The words landed like a dull, heavy blow against my chest. I didn't even feel anger, not right away. It was colder than anger. It was distance, clean, unyielding, definitive. He wasn't arguing with me. He was pushing me away. My son, the boy I had once read bedtime stories to, who had cried into my arms after scraping his knees, who had whispered his secrets to me under the covers, was now a man looking at me with eyes that did not see me as his mother. Only as an obstacle, I pressed my hands together under the table, forcing my voice not to break. Daniel, I never wanted you to feel you owed me anything. I wanted you to know the truth. Your father, he cut me off, his tone sharper. He was my father, and I loved him. Whatever mistakes he made, they're over now. He's gone. Dragging Linda into court won't change that. It just makes things worse. I sat there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe before. Daniel had chosen his side. And it wasn't mine. When I left the cafe, the autumn wind bit at my cheeks. I walked down the sidewalk as if through fog, my thoughts circling like vultures. Had I failed him as a mother? Had I given too much? Or not enough? The world blurred, but the cold stayed sharp, cutting through every layer I wore. That evening, I sat in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling. I tried to remember the first time I had suspected Robert's distance, the first moment I had looked into his eyes and realized they no longer belonged entirely to me. But memory is cruel. It does not give answers. It only gives fragments, shadows of smiles, the sound of doors closing at odd hours, the weight of silence at the dinner table. The following days were filled with restlessness. I could not eat much nor sleep. I moved through the house as though I were haunting it. Robert's absence was everywhere, and yet so was his presence, in the scent of his cologne, in the crease of his shoes left by the door, in the unpaid bills stacked neatly on his desk. My home had become a museum of deceit, curated carefully by the man I once loved. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I turned again to the basement, to that cardboard box filled with photos. I spread them across the floor like puzzle pieces, trying to piece together the story I had been denied. Robert with Linda at a company gala, his arm brushing hers, his smile more alive than I had seen in years. Linda in the passenger seat of his car. Robert carrying a bouquet of roses, not for me, never for me. And then, that single damning photo, Daniel standing beside them, barely a teenager, smiling with unease, but smiling nonetheless. At the corner, the words I had uncovered echoed like a curse. Our little family will be official one day. That phrase haunted me. It explained everything: the will, Daniel's composure, his defense of Linda. He had been part of it, perhaps not knowingly, not willingly, but long enough for the boundaries to blur. They had formed a shadow family while I was reduced to a footnote. I didn't know whether to scream or collapse. Instead, I sat quietly, staring at the photos until dawn crept through the basement windows. And in that pale light, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I didn't fight, I would disappear completely. Robert had tried to erase me from his legacy. Daniel was slipping from my grasp. If I allowed myself to be silent now, I would vanish. Not just from the will, not just from the family, but from my own life. That morning, I took out a notepad and began to write. Every memory, every odd moment, every unexplained absence, every inconsistency in Robert's business dealings. I listed names, dates, places. My handwriting shook, but the ink was bold. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew I couldn't stand still any longer. When I closed the notebook, I looked at the candle stub still sitting in the kitchen from the night I had played jazz. I lit it again and whispered to myself, "You are not gone. You are not erased. You are still here." I had thought betrayal would be the end of me, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. The notebook filled faster than I expected. Each page carried fragments of memory that had once seemed trivial, but now glittered with significance, like pieces of glass catching light. Robert's late-night business trips, Linda showing up at holiday events I never questioned, Daniel's easy familiarity with her. It was all there. What had once been background noise in my life now sounded like a loud, undeniable melody of betrayal. I didn't stop at memories. I went to the library and spent long hours scrolling through public records. Property deeds, financial filings, obscure tax notes that most people would skim over. I wasn't most people. Once upon a time, I had been Robert's financial consultant, the person he trusted, or pretended to trust, with every digit, every ledger, every column of numbers. Numbers don't lie. They tell stories more honest than words. And the story they told now was clear. Money had moved from Robert's company into Linda's life, disguised as consulting fees and housing stipends. It was Ruth, my old colleague, who confirmed what I suspected. I called her on a cold Tuesday afternoon. She was at home, helping her daughter with a fussy grandchild, but she answered my questions with the same sharpness she had back in our working days. "Send me what you've got," she said. "I'll run it against some old files. If he diverted company money, there'll be a trail." When she called back 3 days later, her voice was low, controlled. "Maggie, I found 3 payments. Shell company. No physical office. Staggered just outside the audit cycles, totaling over $350,000. All tied to Linda." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I've ever been," she said. Then softer. "This isn't just a marital betrayal anymore, Maggie. This is fraud." The word hung between us. Fraud. Robert hadn't just betrayed me. He had broken the law, and Linda had been his accomplice. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the photographs of Robert and Linda on her Facebook page. Her captions, so smug in their simplicity, took on a sinister weight. "His smile is my favorite reward." I imagined that smile being built on stolen money, on lies, on the ring I sold to send Daniel to school. My hands trembled, but my resolve hardened. I could no longer think of Linda as a woman who simply stumbled into my life. She had carved her place here deliberately, chiseling away at me until I no longer existed in Robert's world. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Michelle Robinson, a woman in her 50s with a warm but no-nonsense voice. She listened to me speak, about the documents, the transfers, the lies, and when I finished, she said calmly, "You need to send me everything you have. Every document, every photograph, every note. If you want justice, we will build it." I hung up, my heart pounding. For hours, I gathered files, printed screenshots, made copies of Ruth's findings, downloaded every damning image of Robert and Linda. The pile grew until it filled a thick manila folder. It felt heavy in my hands, heavier than grief, heavier than betrayal. It was the weight of truth. Michelle's office was in a sleek glass skyscraper downtown. When I entered the lobby, I almost turned back. I felt small against the marble walls, out of place in my worn coat and modest shoes. But then I remembered Robert's smirk, Linda's hand resting on his arm, Daniel's cold voice telling me I made everyone uncomfortable. I squared my shoulders and took the elevator up. Michelle greeted me with a professional smile and eyes that missed nothing. Her haircut was sharp, her suit perfectly tailored, her presence both comforting and formidable. She took the folder from me, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency. Every so often she nodded. "We'll go through this," she said at last, "and we'll see what sticks." "Thank you," I said, my throat tight. She betrayed me. My husband betrayed me. My son defends her. I want her to pay back every last cent. Michelle pushed her glasses higher on her nose. "Then we'll make her." The months that followed were consumed by the case. Meetings, affidavits, filings. My days revolved around emails from Michelle and updates from Ruth. At times, the weight of it all pressed down on me so heavily I wondered if I could keep going. But every time doubt whispered in my ear, I thought of Linda's smirk in those photographs. I thought of Robert's lies. I thought of Daniel's voice telling me I was too strong. And I reminded myself, yes, I was strong. And this time, that strength was mine. The lawsuit hit like a storm. It spread quickly, through Robert's old firm, through Linda's social circle, through whispers in the community. People who once smiled politely at me in the grocery store now leaned in with hushed voices, asking if it was true. Was Robert really funding his mistress with stolen money? I didn't confirm or deny. I simply walked past them with my head high, as though I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. Linda, of course, fought back. Her lawyer argued that the payments were legitimate consulting fees. They produced invoices, shoddy, half-fabricated documents Robert must have drafted to cover his tracks. But Michelle was relentless. We had Ruth's annotated records, the gaps in the audits, the dates that aligned too neatly with Robert's business trips. And we had the photographs. The photos showed not a consultant, but a lover, not a professional relationship, but a second family. When I took the stand, I spoke slowly, carefully. I told the court about the 40 years of marriage, the sacrifices I had made, the trust I had given Robert. I spoke of the nights I stayed awake with Daniel during his asthma attacks, the ring I had sold for his education, the years I spent smiling through Robert's cold silences. My voice wavered, but I did not cry. I looked at the judge, a black woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen too much, and I thought I saw in her face an understanding deeper than words. Linda sat across from me, her hair styled, her lips painted, her face arranged in feigned composure. But when I spoke of trust-breaking, of the silence that consumed a marriage, I saw her flinch, just once, as though the truth pierced her armor. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Linda was ordered to return every dollar, with interest, over $1 million in total. She was forced to sell the properties, stripped of her reputation, and left with nothing. Justice at last had a name, and it was mine. But victories, I would learn, are not without scars. Because Daniel was not on my side. The first time Daniel called me after the lawsuit was not to reconcile. It was to accuse. "You're destroying his memory," he said, his voice sharp with a kind of wounded pride. "Dad worked hard his whole life, and now you've dragged him through the mud." For what? For money? For revenge? I pressed the phone harder against my ear, staring at the ceiling in my dimly lit bedroom. "Daniel, your father's memory is not what you think it is. What you're holding on to is a fairy tale. He was a con man, and he used his company's money to betray me and you. That's the truth." There was a pause on the line, heavy and suffocating, and then the click of disconnection. He didn't call back. I sat with the silence for a long time, the phone still in my hand, as though waiting for it to ring again. It never did. That was the night I realized that my victory in court had cost me something far dearer than money. It had cost me my son. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Life fell into a new rhythm, one I had never known before. My mornings were filled with paperwork, follow-up meetings with Michelle, and quiet coffee rituals at the kitchen table. The afternoons stretched long and empty, marked only by the sound of neighborhood children riding bikes outside or Giselle tending her roses across the street. In the evenings I played old records, jazz, blues, sometimes a little Motown, letting the music fill the rooms Robert's silence had once ruled. I learned to live alone. At first, solitude felt like a punishment. The house seemed too large, its walls echoing with conversations that no longer existed. But slowly, imperceptibly, I began to discover its gifts. I started cooking meals for one, experimenting with flavors I'd never tried because Robert had been particular. I took long walks through the park, where the smell of damp earth and fresh grass reminded me I was still alive. I even signed up for a pottery class at the community center, shaping clay with hands that had once only known ledgers and balance sheets. For the first time in decades, I asked myself a question I had forgotten how to ask. What do I want? It was not an easy question. Sometimes the answer was as simple as wanting a good night's sleep. Other times, it was a fierce yearning for companionship, for laughter at the dinner table, for Daniel's voice saying, "Mom, I love you." That longing was the hardest. Months passed before the case against Linda faded from public gossip. People moved on, as they always do, but the story lingered in me. It clung to the corners of my heart like dust that no amount of sweeping could clear. Then, 2 years later, my father died. He had been living in a nursing home, his health slowly declining, and though the call from the director wasn't unexpected, it still hollowed me out. The funeral was simple, attended by cousins, a few of his old friends, and me. I wasn't expecting Daniel, but he came when I saw him step into the church, tall in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, my breath caught. He looked older, more serious, the boyishness I had once held close to my chest now gone. Our eyes met across the aisle, and for the briefest moment, I thought he might turn around and leave. But he didn't. He walked to me, and when he reached me, he embraced me. I felt the warmth of his body, the solidity of his arms around me, and I realized how much I had missed him. Tears pricked my eyes, but I held them back. I didn't want this reunion to drown in grief. We didn't speak much during the ceremony. But afterward, standing near the garden behind the church, Daniel finally broke the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice lower, steadier. "I've been thinking about everything. About Dad, about Linda, about you." I nodded, afraid to interrupt. "I defended an illusion," he continued. "I didn't want to believe he was flawed. I thought loving him meant protecting his memory. But I see now I wasn't protecting him. I was just pushing you away, and I'm sorry." The apology fell softly between us, fragile as glass. I placed my hand on his cheek, the way I had when he was small. "I believed in you the whole time, Daniel. Even when you turned your back on me, I knew you would find your way back." He hugged me again, tighter this time. And in that moment, all the fractures in my heart, though not gone, felt like they were mending. Later, when we returned to my house, a few relatives gathered for coffee and simple sandwiches. We sat around the kitchen table, where so much pain had once been brewed, and somehow the room felt lighter. Daniel even made a joke, one so dry it caught me off guard, and everyone laughed. At one point, he looked at me with a boyish grin. "Mom, since when are you so good at giving speeches? That thing you said about Grandpa's tree, it was beautiful." I laughed softly. "I always was, Daniel. You just weren't listening," he chuckled, shaking his head. For the first time in years, I saw his smile, not the polite, distant one he wore for strangers, but the real one. The one I had kissed countless times when he was little. That evening, after everyone left, I wandered into the garden alone. The crab apple tree I had planted 20 years ago stood tall, its branches reaching out with stubborn vitality. I touched the rough bark, remembering how I had nearly cut it down the year it failed to bloom. But then, that spring, it had surprised me, blossoms spilling across its branches earlier than ever. It had taught me a lesson I hadn't known I was learning. What still has life should never be abandoned. I turned back toward the house, the porch light glowing softly, the wind chimes tinkling like laughter. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. I slipped off my heels, walked barefoot into the house, and closed the door behind me. I knew who I was now. I was not the discarded wife, not the woman erased from a family portrait, not the silent keeper of another's secrets. I was a survivor. I was a fighter, and the truth had finally set me free. But freedom, I would come to learn, was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. Freedom, once I tasted it, was not as simple as I had imagined. It wasn't about court victories or reclaiming property. It was quieter, subtler, a kind of daily decision to keep breathing, to keep moving, to keep choosing myself after decades of never doing so. I began to notice how empty spaces could transform into something alive. The living room, once arranged to Robert's taste with stiff-backed chairs and a perfectly centered rug, now bore the softness of my own choices. I bought a wide, comfortable armchair in a shade of sage green. I stacked books on the side table, novels I had never had time to read when dinners, appointments, and Robert's schedules ruled my life. On weekends, I wandered through the farmer's market, filling cloth bags with fresh herbs, peaches, and sourdough bread. I cooked meals just for me, pasta rich with basil and garlic, soups laced with spices I'd never dared to use before. I discovered that cooking wasn't only an act of duty. It could be a form of art, of love, even if I was the only one at the table. Yet freedom also came with loneliness. There were nights when the silence pressed against me too heavily, when the sound of the clock in the hallway ticked with merciless insistence. On those nights I reached for my journal. I filled its pages with thoughts, memories, dreams, and questions that had no answers. I wrote about Robert's betrayals, but I also wrote about the girl I had once been. The girl who had dreamed of seeing Paris, who loved bold earrings, who sang loudly in the car with the windows rolled down. She was still there, beneath the ashes. Daniel and I began meeting regularly. At first, our conversations were tentative, guarded. He would talk about his work, about deadlines and code, about new colleagues. I would listen, grateful for every detail, even if it was ordinary. In time, he asked about me, what I was reading, what I was doing with my days. These questions were small, but they felt like bridges I had thought were lost forever. One Sunday, he came by unexpectedly with a box of pastries. "Thought you might like these," he said awkwardly, setting them on the counter. I noticed his eyes scanning the kitchen, taking in the changes, my new kettle, the fresh flowers in the vase. "Everything looks different," he murmured. "Different good or different bad?" I teased. "Different good," he admitted, giving me a faint smile. We sat at the table, the same table where I had once confronted the shattering truth of my marriage. Now the air was lighter. Daniel bit into a croissant, flakes scattering onto his shirt, and for a moment I saw the boy he had been, the one who used to sneak sugar cookies before dinner. My heart softened, but healing wasn't linear. There were still shadows that lingered. Sometimes when Daniel mentioned Linda, even casually, my chest tightened. He still called her by her first name, not that woman, as I did in my head. He never said it with bitterness, but with a trace of warmth, a memory I couldn't erase. One evening, as we walked in the park, I asked him quietly, "Do you still think of her as family?" He hesitated, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "She was part of my life for a long time, Mom. She listened when Dad needed someone. She listened when I needed someone, but..." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a kind of clarity I hadn't seen before. "That doesn't mean she was more of a mother to me than you." I know the difference now. The weight of his words settled in me like a bomb. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a full undoing of the pain, but it was enough. Enough to believe that trust could grow again. Meanwhile, Ruth and I stayed close. She checked in often, partly to see how the case's aftermath was unfolding, but mostly out of genuine care. One afternoon, she invited me over for tea. Her bungalow smelled faintly of lemon polish, and her granddaughter's toys were scattered in the living room. "You've come far, Maggie," she said, pouring chamomile into porcelain cups. "Most women in your place would have broken under the weight of it. But you fought back. You found yourself again." I smiled, though my eyes pricked with tears. "Some days I don't feel strong. Some days I still feel like the woman sitting in that lawyer's office, stunned out of my own life." Ruth patted my hand. "Strength isn't about never doubting. It's about choosing to stand up anyway." Her words lingered with me as I drove home. That night, I walked out to the garden again. The crab apple tree swayed in the breeze, its branches whispering secrets to the night. I thought of how close I had come to cutting it down, how certain I had been that it was dead. Yet, life had surprised me. I realized then that survival wasn't just about fighting battles in courtrooms. It was about reclaiming the rhythm of my days, about letting joy sneak back in through the cracks. It was about laughter with Daniel over pastries, about pottery clay drying beneath my fingernails, about music filling the corners of rooms once haunted by silence. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. My hair was streaked with silver now, my skin marked by lines. But my eyes held something they hadn't in years. A spark. I leaned closer and whispered to myself, "You are enough," and for the first time, I believed it, but life, unpredictable as it always is, wasn't finished testing me. Because just when I thought the past had finally settled into quiet ashes, a letter arrived in the mail. It was in Daniel's handwriting, but addressed from a return address I recognized instantly, Linda's. The envelope felt heavier than its weight, as though every secret I thought I had buried inside the courtroom had been sealed in with it. My hands shook as I tore it open, the paper splitting like fragile skin. Inside was a single letter, handwritten in careful script that wasn't Daniel's after all. It was Linda's. I sat down at the kitchen table staring at the words. "Margaret, I know I am the last person you want to hear from. I debated whether to write this at all, but Daniel insisted. He believes we cannot heal without honesty. I owe you the truth. Not the truth Robert told me to repeat, not the truth the lawyers tried to craft in court, but my truth. Please, if only once, listen." I stopped there, my pulse thundering in my ears. My instinct was to tear it up, to shred it until her voice was nothing but pulp and ink stains. But some stubborn part of me, some scarred part that wanted no more shadows, forced me to keep reading. She wrote of how she met Robert at a business conference, how their friendship had turned into late-night phone calls, how she convinced herself she wasn't doing anything wrong because he was already unhappy. She painted herself as a companion, a balm for his loneliness, someone who gave him what I supposedly withheld. And then she admitted it. The money, the gifts, the deceit. I told myself I was helping him. He said he needed someone to trust with the investments. He promised he would tell you one day. I was foolish to believe it. I see now that I was not just his accomplice, I was his escape. For that, I am deeply sorry. The words blurred as tears stung my eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were hot, furious tears. Sorry? She thought sorry could erase years of betrayal, of stolen love, of a son's divided loyalty. I folded the letter sharply and pushed it away. My first instinct was to call Daniel and demand why he had given her my address, why he thought I needed to read her confessions. But I stopped myself. I realized something startling. I wasn't as broken by her words as I would have been years ago. They didn't carry the power to crush me anymore. Instead, they revealed a strange kind of victory. Linda was stripped bare. No house by the sea. No symphonies with my husband. No carefully staged lies. Only a hollow apology written on cheap stationery. Still, I couldn't ignore the ache that her words stirred. That ache wasn't about Linda at all. It was about Robert. The man I had loved for 40 years. The man I thought I knew better than anyone. Even after the trial, even after all the evidence, part of me had clung to the illusion that maybe he had loved me in his own flawed way. But Linda's letter painted a different picture. A man who was never torn, never conflicted, but fully invested in his double life. I needed air. I slipped on my shoes and walked out into the neighborhood. The sun was setting, streaking the sky with fire, and the sound of children playing echoed faintly from the park. I passed by Giselle's house. Her roses were still blooming, fierce and unapologetic. She was watering them and she waved. "You look troubled, Maggie," she called. I hesitated, then walked closer. "I got a letter today. From Linda." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She simply gestured toward her porch. "Sit." I sank into the wicker chair, the familiar creak of it oddly comforting. I handed her the folded letter. She slipped on her reading glasses and read silently, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she finished, she looked at me steadily. "She's still trying to justify herself. Sorry isn't for you, it's for her. Don't give her the satisfaction of holding on to your attention." I nodded slowly. Daniel wanted me to read it. "He thinks it'll help us all heal." Giselle's eyes softened. "He's still young. He doesn't understand that not every wound closes. Some you just learn to live with." Her words rang true. That night, I placed the letter in a drawer, not in anger, not in reverence, but as one stores an artifact, proof of a life lived. Mistakes made, scars earned. The following week, Daniel visited. Over coffee, I asked him, "Why did you want me to read her letter?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Because I needed you to know she regrets it. I thought maybe if you saw that, it would give you peace." "Peace doesn't come from her regret," I said softly. "It comes from me choosing to move on." Daniel studied me, then nodded. "Maybe you're stronger than I realized." "I had to be," I whispered. There was silence between us for a long time, but it wasn't the brittle silence of the past. It was softer, laced with understanding. Later, after Daniel left, I returned to my garden. The crab apple tree was turning its leaves, preparing for another season. I realized that grief and betrayal worked the same way. They didn't disappear. They changed shape. They shed. They regrew. They transformed into something you could live alongside. As I stood there, a quiet certainty settled in my chest. I didn't need Linda's words to define my story. I had already written my own, but still I wondered, was there one last truth Robert had left behind, something I had yet to uncover? Autumn crept in gently, as though the world itself was trying to soothe me. The air carried a crispness that reminded me of childhood walks in wool coats, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the smoky scent of distant bonfires. I found myself spending more time outside, pruning, sweeping, breathing. After months of battles and revelations, the quiet rhythm of the season felt like medicine. One morning, I received a phone call from Michelle Robinson, my lawyer. Her voice was steady, calm, but with a subtle weight that told me she had news. "Maggie," she began, "the firm has finished their final review of Robert's estate. They've discovered some records that were sealed years ago. I think you need to see them." My chest tightened. "What kind of records?" "Bank accounts, overseas transfers. Some of them date back 15 years. I don't want to explain over the phone. Can you come in tomorrow?" I agreed. That night, sleep evaded me. I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the windows, my mind replaying every moment of my marriage. Had I only seen the surface of Robert's betrayal? Was there an even deeper labyrinth of secrets beneath? The next day, I sat across from Michelle in her sleek office. She pushed a folder toward me, her hands deliberate, her eyes watchful. I opened it. Inside were statements from a Swiss account. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved quietly, regularly, for over a decade. The beneficiary? Not Linda, not any name I recognized. Instead, the funds had been withdrawn in cash or funneled into anonymous trusts. Michelle leaned forward. "We don't know where the money ultimately went. But Maggie, this isn't just about Linda. Robert was hiding far more than an affair. He may have been building a life no one knew about." I sat there, stunned, the room tilting slightly. I had thought the courtroom had given me closure, that Linda's downfall had been the end of my story. But now it seemed Robert had left behind more shadows than truths. "Why are you showing me this now?" I whispered. "Because you deserve to know," Michelle said firmly. "And because legally, as his wife, you may still have claims to part of it. But before we proceed, I need to ask you, do you want to keep digging?" Her question hung in the air. Did I want to keep peeling back layers of deceit, risking more heartbreak? Or did I want to draw a line, to say enough, to live without unearthing every skeleton? I took the folder home. I didn't open it again that night. Instead, I sat by the window and watched the crabapple tree sway in the wind. Life had already taught me that truth carried a cost. But ignorance did too. The following weekend, Daniel came over with groceries. He was slowly making it a ritual, these quiet visits. As we chopped vegetables together, I asked him, "Daniel, do you think it's better to know everything, even if it hurts? Or is it better to leave some things buried?" He paused, knife in hand, and looked at me thoughtfully. When I defended Dad, I thought I was protecting him. But really, I was protecting myself from the truth. It was easier to believe in him than to face who he really was. And that destroyed more than it saved. I studied his face, older now, steadier. "So you'd rather know no matter what?" He nodded. "Yes, because only then can you decide what to do with it." His words stayed with me. That night I reopened the folder. I traced the columns of numbers, the coded entries, the unfamiliar names. One in particular stood out, a transfer labeled A. Smith Foundation, Smith, my own last name. Coincidence? Or was it his cruel way of hiding money in plain sight, mocking me even in secrecy? I called Ruth. She picked up on the second ring, her voice still carrying that brisk, no-nonsense energy. When I told her about the new records, she didn't sound surprised. "Robert was always clever with paper trails," she said. "But if there's a foundation, we can find it." "Give me a few days." 3 days later, she called back. "Maggie, I found it. The A. Smith Foundation is registered as a charitable trust. But get this, it funds scholarships for architecture students. He's been quietly donating for years." I froze. "Scholarships? Charity? Are you saying he wasn't pocketing the money?" "Not exactly," Ruth said. "The trust looks legitimate, but it's funded through those hidden transfers. It's possible he wanted a legacy separate from both you and Linda. Something just his." I sat there speechless, torn between outrage and something dangerously close to admiration. Robert, the man who betrayed me, had also been secretly paying for students' educations. Why had he never told me? Why had he chosen to share that part of himself with no one? That night, I walked to the garden again. I stared up at the stars, the same stars I once sat under with a heartbroken teenage son. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit something complicated. Robert had not been only a villain. He had been selfish, deceitful, unfaithful, but he had also carried a piece of generosity he shared with strangers instead of his own family. It didn't absolve him, but it made him human, and somehow, strangely, that realization gave me more closure than the trial ever had. The next morning, I wrote in my journal, "I do not need Robert to be perfect or damned. I only need him to be gone, and for me to remain." I closed the journal, poured myself a cup of tea, and felt the first glimmer of peace settle into my bones. Winter descended with a sharpness that seemed to echo the truths I had uncovered. The nights grew long, the wind cut through the cracks in the windows, and the garden lay dormant under a veil of frost. I spent hours inside, reading, writing, and slowly stitching together a life that was finally mine. Daniel visited more often, and though our conversations were not always easy, they had a gentleness to them that reminded me of the boy I once cradled during his asthma attacks. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands folded tightly, his gaze serious. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking. All those years you carried everything for us, me, Dad, the house, the money. I never really saw it. I thought you were just managing things. But now I realize you were holding us together." His words warmed me more than the fireplace beside us. For so long I had been invisible, my sacrifices unseen. To hear my son finally recognize me was a balm I hadn't known I needed. "I didn't do it perfectly," I replied softly. "And maybe I gave too much." Daniel shook his head. "You gave what you had, and I took it for granted." We sat there in silence, the snow tapping gently against the windows. It was enough, but life wasn't only about reconciling with the past. It was about deciding what to do with the future. The discovery of Robert's secret foundation lingered in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about those students, about the money that had passed through his hands into theirs. Was it tainted, or was it redeemed by its purpose? One morning, I drove into the city and found the office of the A. Smith Foundation. It was a small suite in a brick building, nothing flashy, nothing like the skyscraper where Michelle practiced. A young woman at the front desk greeted me politely. "May I help you?" I hesitated, then said, "I'd like to know more about your scholarships. I may have a connection to the founder." She gave me a curious look but handed me a brochure. Inside were photos of smiling students holding certificates, stories of first-generation college graduates, aspiring architects who had been given a chance. As I read their words, gratitude, hope, ambition, I felt something stir inside me. These were lives changed, not by Linda, not by betrayal, but by an unexpected part of Robert's legacy. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger when I thought of him. I felt complexity. I walked out of the office into the brittle winter sunlight, the brochure pressed to my chest. Perhaps this was my choice now, not to erase Robert's contradictions, but to carry forward the parts that had meaning. That evening, I told Daniel what I had discovered. He listened quietly, his brow furrowed. "So, Dad, he wasn't just lying. He was also trying to do something good?" "Yes," I said. "But he did it in secret, and that secrecy destroyed us." Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe we can honor the good without forgetting the bad." His words lingered. "Could we? Could I?" The following week, I met Ruth for lunch at a quiet cafe. She looked at me with that knowing sharpness she always had. "You look lighter," she said. "I think I am," I admitted. "Ruth, I want to support the foundation. Not to excuse Robert, but to turn it into something transparent, something clean. If his money built the bones of it, maybe I can give it a heart." Her eyes softened. "That sounds like the Maggie I remember. The one who could balance a ledger in one hand and fight for her family with the other." We laughed. And in that laughter, I felt decades of tension release. So I began. I met with Michelle to draft legal papers, ensuring the foundation's finances would be audited, its mission clear. I introduced myself to its board, and for the first time, I put my own name, not Robert's, into its story. The work gave me purpose. It wasn't about repairing what Robert had done. It was about planting something new in the soil of old betrayals. One snowy evening, Daniel joined me at a scholarship dinner. He wore a dark suit and looked so much like his father in that moment it almost broke me. But when he stood beside me, speaking to the students about resilience, about learning from the past, I knew he wasn't Robert. He was his own man, and he was finally mine again. Later that night, as I drove home through streets glittering with snow, I thought about the long road that had brought me here. The lies, the trial, the silence with my son, the rediscovery of myself. I whispered aloud in the car, "I'm still here." And for the first time, those words didn't sound like defiance. They sounded like peace. That winter was cold, but it was also full of quiet beginnings. I tended the crab apple tree under its frost, wrapped gifts for Daniel with care, and began planning spring projects for the foundation. The past no longer weighed on me like a chain. It sat beside me, a scar that told a story, but I was free to choose the next chapter. Spring came softly, with shy buds breaking through the soil and the crab apple tree in my yard stretching toward the sky. Its blossoms, pale pink and delicate, returned stronger than ever, and I couldn't help but see myself in its resilience. By then, months had passed since the trial, since Linda had faded from our lives like a shadow at dusk. Daniel and I were no longer estranged. He visited every Sunday for dinner, sometimes bringing a bottle of wine, sometimes just himself. He still carried fragments of grief for Robert, but he had begun to see the truth with clearer eyes. One Sunday evening, after a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, he looked across the table and said, "Mom, I've been offered a new job." "A leadership role," I smiled. "That's wonderful." He nodded, then added, "It's in New York. I'll be moving this summer." For a moment, the words tightened something inside me. But then I saw the light in his face, the eagerness, the drive. He was no longer a boy clinging to me, nor a man defending illusions. He was his own person, ready to lead his own life. "I'm proud of you," I said softly. "Go, build your life. That's what I always wanted for you." He reached across the table and took my hand. "And I'll come back. Always." The warmth of his hand in mine told me that even as he built a life far away, the bond between us was mended. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work with the foundation. I organized meetings, met students, listened to their stories. One young woman, Clara, told me she had grown up in a neighborhood where few dared to dream beyond high school. With the scholarship, she was studying architecture and wanted to design affordable housing. Her words moved me. In her determination, I saw an echo of my younger self, the woman who once sat at Robert's board meetings, confident and sharp. Clara wasn't just a student. She was proof that my story, even in its brokenness, could give rise to something hopeful. At the Foundation's spring banquet, I stood at the podium, my notes trembling slightly in my hand. Looking out at the crowd, students, donors, my son sitting near the front, I felt a wave of calm. I stand before you, not as someone untouched by betrayal, but as someone transformed by it, I began. Life has ways of erasing us, of convincing us that our sacrifices are invisible. But I've learned that even when we are overlooked, our love, our work, and our strength plant seeds. And today, those seeds bloom in each of you. The room was silent, listening. I took a breath. This foundation is not about the man who once funded it in secret. It is about the future we build in the open. It is about resilience, integrity, and possibility. And it is about reclaiming the stories we were once cut out of. When I finished, applause rose like a wave, filling the hall. Daniel stood and clapped, his face bright with pride. I smiled at him, and for once I didn't feel invisible. After the event, people approached me. Students, parents, colleagues. They thanked me, they told me their stories, and in their words, I felt a community forming around me. I was no longer just a widow left behind. I was a woman leading something forward. That night, back home, I stepped outside onto the porch. The crabapple tree swayed gently in the breeze, its blossoms falling like pink snowflakes onto the grass. The air smelled of earth and renewal. I thought back to the funeral, to the day Daniel had stood at the podium and thanked Linda, to the way I had felt erased, discarded. How far I had come since then. Robert was gone. Linda was gone. The lies, the fraud, the court battles, they were chapters behind me now. What remained was truth, hard-won and heavy, but also liberating. I sat on the porch steps, my hands folded in my lap, and whispered to the night, I know who I am now. I was not the invisible wife. I was not the shadow in someone else's story. I was Maggie Smith, a woman who had survived betrayal, who had rebuilt herself from ashes, who had found her own voice. And as the wind rustled through the blossoms, I knew with a certainty that the rest of my life was mine alone to write. The world stretched out before me like an unwritten book, and for the first time in 40 years, the pen was in my hand. I smiled, closed my eyes, and breathed in the spring air. I was free.